She wore a simple dress to her cousin's wedding. They called her an embarrassment, laughed at her worn shoes, then pushed her toward the door. But what they didn't know was that the quiet woman they were humiliating had a secret, and he was about to walk through those doors with an army behind him. If you love stories about karma and justice, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell because you won't want to miss what happens next. Trust me, this wedding is about to become unforgettable. Now let's dive in. Caroline Hayes had always been the kind of person who found joy in small things. A good book, a quiet afternoon, the smell of coffee on a Sunday morning. At 28 years old, she worked as a librarian in a small town about 3 hours north of where she grew up. She lived in a modest apartment, drove a car that had seen better days, and wore clothes that were clean and presentable, but never flashy. Caroline didn't need much to be happy. She had her work, her books, and a life that felt peaceful and full in ways that money couldn't measure. So when the wedding invitation arrived in her mailbox 2 months ago, she'd been genuinely excited. Her cousin Brittany was getting married, and despite the fact that they hadn't been close in years, Caroline wanted to be there. Family mattered to her, even if her family didn't always make her feel like she mattered back. She'd requested the day off work, bought a modest navy dress that fit her budget, and made the drive down on a sunny Saturday morning with a wrapped gift on her passenger seat and hope in her heart. The wedding was being held at Rosewood Country Club, the kind of place that had valets and fountains, and more forks at each place setting than Caroline had in her entire kitchen. She'd known it would be fancy. Brittany's mother, Aunt Margaret, had married well and never let anyone forget it. But Caroline hadn't expected to feel quite so out of place the moment she walked through the doors. The women around her wore designer dresses with price tags that could have covered Caroline's rent for 3 months. The men had watches that glinted in the chandelier light. Everything sparkled. Everything gleamed. And Caroline, in her simple navy dress and worn ballet flats, felt like a smudge on an otherwise perfect picture. She found her seat at a table near the back, tucked away from the main action. The ceremony had been beautiful, she had to admit. Brittany looked radiant in a gown that probably cost more than Caroline made in half a year. Her new husband, Todd, was handsome in that polished country club way. Everything was perfect. Picture perfect. Instagram perfect. Caroline clapped when everyone else clapped and smiled when everyone else smiled, trying her best to blend in and just be happy for her cousin. But it didn't take long for the whispers to start. Caroline noticed Aunt Margaret staring at her from across the room during cocktail hour, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Margaret leaned over to whisper something to her sister Diane, and both women turned to look directly at Caroline. Then came the snickers from a group of younger cousins she barely knew. One of them pointed at her shoes. Another made a comment just loud enough for Caroline to hear about shopping at thrift stores. Caroline felt her cheeks flush hot, but she kept her head down and moved toward the reception hall, hoping that once everyone had some champagne and dinner, they'd forget she was even there. She should have known better. Margaret had never been the type to let anything go, especially not something she perceived as an embarrassment to the family image. Caroline was filling her water glass at her table when she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Aunt Margaret standing there with Diane beside her, both women wearing smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "Caroline, sweetie," Margaret said in that syrupy voice people use when they're about to say something cruel. "We need to have a little chat." Caroline's stomach dropped, but she nodded and followed them to a quiet corner near the coat check. Margaret didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Honey, I'm going to be direct with you because I think that's kinder in the long run. You look, you look out of place here. This is a very important day for Brittany, and we've worked so hard to make everything perfect. The photographer has been taking candid shots all evening, and frankly, we're concerned about how the photos are going to turn out with you in them." Caroline felt like she'd been slapped. "I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying." Diane jumped in, her voice sharp and impatient. "She's saying you don't fit the aesthetic, Caroline. Look around you. Look at what everyone else is wearing. This is a high society wedding, not a church potluck." Margaret placed a hand on Caroline's arm, and Caroline resisted the urge to pull away. "We're not trying to be mean, sweetheart, but wouldn't you be more comfortable leaving? You could say you're not feeling well. No one would think less of you." Before Caroline could respond, Brittany herself appeared, her face flushed from champagne and dancing. "Mom, what's going on?" Margaret turned to her daughter with a concerned expression. "Just having a chat with Caroline, dear. We were thinking she might want to head out early." Brittany looked at Caroline, and for just a moment, Caroline saw something like guilt flash across her cousin's face, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Oh, I mean, if you're not feeling well, Caroline, you should definitely go. We don't want you to feel like you have to stay if you're uncomfortable." The words hit Caroline like a punch to the gut. They were actually doing this. They were actually asking her to leave. "I drove 3 hours to be here," Caroline said quietly, hating how small her voice sounded. "I took the day off work. I brought a gift. I'm not uncomfortable. I just wanted to celebrate with family." Todd had wandered over now, probably curious about the small group huddled in the corner of his wedding reception. "What's the holdup, ladies?" Margaret smiled at her new son-in-law. "Just a small family matter. Nothing to worry about." But Todd's eyes had already landed on Caroline's shoes, and his mouth curved into a smirk. "Let me guess. Someone didn't get the memo about dress code." A few nearby guests laughed, and Caroline felt her face burn with humiliation. Margaret took that as her cue to escalate. "Caroline, we're asking you nicely to leave. Please don't make this difficult." The words hung in the air like a threat. Caroline looked at Brittany one more time, hoping her cousin would say something, anything, to stop this. But Brittany just looked away. That was the moment Caroline's heart truly broke. Not because of the expensive dresses or the mean comments or even being asked to leave, but because her own family, people who shared her blood, couldn't find it in themselves to treat her with basic human decency. "Fine," Caroline whispered. "I'll go." She walked back to her table, grabbed her small purse, and headed for the exit with as much dignity as she could muster. Behind her, she could hear Margaret telling someone that Caroline wasn't feeling well and had to leave early. The lie was easier than the truth, Caroline supposed. Easier to pretend she was sick than to admit they'd thrown her out like garbage. The evening air hit her face as she stepped outside, and Caroline realized her hands were shaking. She walked past the valets and the fancy cars until she found a bench near the parking lot, tucked behind some hedges where no one would see her. Only then did she let the tears come. Not loud, dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that slid down her cheeks as she sat there in her simple navy dress, clutching her purse and wondering what she'd done to deserve such cruelty. She'd never asked her family for anything, never flaunted anything, or made anyone feel small. She just wanted to be included, to be treated like she mattered. Her phone buzzed in her purse, and Caroline wiped her eyes before pulling it out. One missed call from Dee. Despite everything, she felt a small smile tug at her lips. Daniel. Her Daniel. They'd agreed he wouldn't come to the wedding because Caroline had wanted to keep their relationship private for a while longer. She'd wanted people to know her for who she was, not for who she was with. Now, sitting on this bench outside the place where her own family had rejected her, that decision felt both stupid and sad. She called him back, and he answered on the first ring. "Hey, beautiful. How's the wedding?" His voice was warm and familiar, and it made Caroline's chest ache. "It's fine," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just needed some air." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Daniel knew her too well. "Caroline, what happened?" She could have lied, should have lied, but she was so tired of pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. "They asked me to leave," she said quietly. "Said I didn't fit the aesthetic, that I was ruining the photos." The silence that followed was different, heavier. When Daniel spoke again, his voice had changed. It was still gentle, still caring, but there was steel underneath it now. "Where are you right now?" Caroline looked around at the empty parking lot, the bench, the hedges. "I'm outside, on a bench. I was just about to drive home." Daniel's response was immediate and firm. "Stay exactly where you are. Don't move. I'm 10 minutes away." Caroline's heart jumped. "Daniel, no, you don't need to come down here. I'm fine, really. I'll just go home and we can talk later." "Caroline," he said, and his voice was so steady, so certain. "I love you, and nobody treats you like that. Nobody. 10 minutes. Please just stay there." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him not to make a scene, that it would just make things worse, that she could handle it. But the truth was, she didn't want to handle it alone anymore. "Okay," she whispered. 10 minutes. She hung up and sat there on the bench, waiting and wondering what Daniel had planned. Whatever it was, she knew one thing for certain. Her family had no idea what was about to hit them. Inside the reception hall, the party was in full swing. Margaret was holding court at the family table, telling anyone who would listen about the unfortunate situation with Caroline. "I felt terrible asking her to leave," she said with practiced sympathy. "But you have to understand, we have standards to maintain. This wedding cost more than most people make in a year. We couldn't have someone who looked like they bought their dress at a discount store ruining our photos." The women around her nodded in agreement, and Margaret felt validated in her decision. Brittany was dancing with Todd, trying not to think about the look on Caroline's face when she'd walked out. Diane was sampling her third slice of cake. Everything was perfect again, or at least, it was about to be perfect, right up until it wasn't. The first sign that something was happening came from the guests seated near the windows. Someone pointed outside at the parking lot, and murmurs began to spread. 3 black SUVs were pulling up to the entrance, followed by a sleek luxury car that probably cost more than most of the vehicles in the lot combined. The valet attendants looked confused, checking their lists for VIP arrivals they might have missed. Then the doors opened, and men in dark suits stepped out. Professional, polished, the kind of security detail you see surrounding politicians and celebrities. They moved with purpose, positioning themselves strategically as the door to the luxury car opened. Margaret noticed the commotion and frowned. Who are these people? Did someone invite guests we don't know about? But no one had an answer because everyone was too busy watching the man who stepped out of that car. He was in his early 30s, tall and composed, wearing a suit that had clearly been tailored specifically for him. Everything about him radiated wealth and power, from his confident stride to the way he carried himself like someone who was used to being the most important person in any room. He walked toward the entrance of the country club, and his security team flanked him without being told. The reception hall doors opened, and every conversation stopped. Every head turned. The man stepped inside and let his eyes scan the room slowly, methodically, like he was cataloging every face and every detail. The room had gone completely silent. Even the band had stopped playing, sensing that something significant was happening. Margaret stood up from her table, her face a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "Excuse me, but this is a private event. If you're not on the guest list, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man's eyes found Margaret, and he walked directly toward her with his security following at a respectful distance. When he spoke, his voice carried across the entire room. Clear, calm, absolutely unmovable. "I'm looking for the family of Brittany Hayes. Someone wants to explain to me why my fiancé was thrown out of this wedding?" The words landed like a bomb. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Brittany stopped dancing mid-step. Diane dropped her fork. Todd looked around confused, trying to figure out what was happening. The man continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling every corner of the room. "My name is Daniel Morrison. I'm engaged to Caroline Hayes. And about 30 minutes ago, she called me in tears because her own family decided she wasn't good enough to be here." Margaret's face went pale, then red, then pale again. "I'm sorry, there must be some misunderstanding. Caroline is... she's not..." But Daniel held up his hand, and Margaret's voice died in her throat. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping it a few times before holding it up. On the screen was a photo of him and Caroline, both smiling, her hand extended to show an engagement ring that caught the light like a star. "No misunderstanding," Daniel said quietly. "She's my fiancée. We've been together for 2 years. She wanted to keep it private because she's a private person. She wanted people to know her for who she is, not who she's with. I respected that. But what I won't respect is anyone treating her like she's worthless." Someone in the crowd gasped. Then someone else pulled out their phone, and within seconds people were frantically Googling the name Daniel Morrison. The whispers started small and then grew like wildfire. "That's Daniel Morrison. The tech guy? Morrison Industries. Oh my God, he's worth billions. 3 billion at least. That's him. That's actually him." Margaret's face had gone from red to a sickly gray. Diane looked like she might faint. Brittany stood frozen on the dance floor, her hand over her mouth. Todd, for once, had nothing clever to say. Daniel let the information sink in for a moment before he continued. Caroline drove 3 hours to be here today. She took time off work. She brought a gift. She asked for nothing except to be treated like family. And you made her feel so unwelcome, so humiliated, that you actually escorted her out because she didn't meet your aesthetic. He said the last word with such disdain that several people flinched. She works as a librarian because she loves books and helping people. She lives simply because she's never needed material things to feel valuable. She's kind and genuine and real in a way most people in this room will never understand. And you threw her out like trash. Margaret tried to recover, her voice shaking. Mr. Morrison, please. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. If we'd known, Daniel's eyes went cold. If you'd known what? That she had money? That she was connected to someone important? That's your defense? You're actually standing there telling me that you would have treated her with basic human decency only if you'd known she had value by your standards? The accusation hung in the air, and Margaret had no response because they both knew it was true. She would have rolled out a red carpet if she'd known Caroline was engaged to a billionaire. But Caroline had just been Caroline, quiet and simple and therefore disposable. Brittany stepped forward, tears running down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. Caroline, I'm so sorry. I didn't. I should have. But Daniel shook his head. She's not here. She's outside, where you sent her, where she's been sitting alone for the past 30 minutes, wondering what she did wrong. He turned to address the entire room one final time. You people spent more on this wedding than most families make in 5 years. You have everything money can buy, but you don't have decency. You don't have character. And you clearly don't have love, because love doesn't calculate someone's worth based on their clothes or their car or their job. He turned to leave, and Margaret panicked. The social implications of this were catastrophic. By tomorrow morning, everyone in their circle would know what they'd done. They'd be pariahs. Please, Margaret called out, her voice desperate now. Please, Mr. Morrison. We made a mistake, a terrible mistake. Let us apologize to Caroline. Let us make this right. Daniel paused at the door and looked back at her with something like pity. You can't make this right. You showed her exactly who you are, and now she knows. Then he walked out, leaving behind a reception hall full of stunned guests and a family that had just destroyed their reputation in less than 10 minutes. Outside, Caroline was still sitting on the bench where he'd left her. She looked up when she heard footsteps and saw Daniel walking toward her, with that expression he got when he was trying very hard to stay calm. You made a scene, didn't you? She said softly. Daniel sat down beside her and took her hand. That wasn't a scene. That was a statement. Caroline let out a shaky laugh that turned into a sob, and Daniel pulled her close. I told you who I was when we met, she whispered against his shoulder. I told you I didn't come from money, that I was just a librarian from a small town. You said it didn't matter. Daniel pulled back just enough to look at her face. It didn't matter then. It doesn't matter now. It will never matter. You're the best person I've ever met, Caroline. Your family's inability to see that says everything about them and nothing about you. They sat there for a moment, just holding each other, while the security team maintained a respectful distance. Then Caroline heard voices behind them, shouting, calling her name. She turned to see Margaret, Brittany, and Diane rushing out of the building, all of them talking over each other. Caroline, please, we're so sorry. We didn't know. Please come back inside. Margaret reached them first, out of breath and desperate. Caroline, sweetheart, please forgive us. We made a terrible mistake. We should never have asked you to leave. Please come back to the reception. You're family. You'll always be family. Caroline stood up slowly, and Daniel stood with her. She looked at her aunt, her cousin, her extended family members who were now gathered near the entrance, watching this unfold. These people who had made her feel small and worthless just an hour ago. These people who were only sorry now because they knew who she was engaged to. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. You didn't need to know who I'm marrying to treat me with respect. You just needed to be decent human beings. That's all I ever wanted from you. Basic decency. And you couldn't even give me that. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Caroline held up her hand. I came here today because I believe family was important. Because I thought that despite everything, despite the differences between us, there was still love underneath it all. But I was wrong. You don't love me. You never did. You tolerated me when I was invisible and rejected me the moment I became visible. The only thing that's changed in the last hour is that now you know rejecting me has consequences. That's not love. That's not even respect. That's just fear. She turned to Brittany, and her voice softened just a little. I hope you have a beautiful marriage. I really do. But I won't be part of this family anymore. I can't, because I deserve better than this. Carolyn took Daniel's hand, and they walked toward his car together. Behind them, Margaret was calling out, making promises and pleas that fell on deaf ears. Diane was crying. Brittany had collapsed into Todd's arms. But Caroline didn't look back. For the first time in her life, she was walking away from people who didn't value her, and it felt like freedom. Daniel opened the car door for her, and she slid into the leather seat. As they pulled away from Rosewood Country Club, leaving behind the fancy wedding and the fancy people and all their empty glitter, Caroline felt something unexpected. Peace. In the months that followed, the story of what happened at Brittany's wedding spread through their social circles like wildfire. Margaret and her family became infamous for their treatment of Caroline. Invitations dried up. Friends became distant. The family that had prided itself on status and connections found themselves slowly isolated by their own cruelty. Meanwhile, Caroline and Daniel got married 6 months later in a small private ceremony, attended only by people who loved Caroline for exactly who she was. She kept her job at the library because it brought her joy. Daniel supported her completely, never once suggesting she should change or become someone different. Together, they donated millions to literacy programs and libraries across the country. Caroline finally had the resources to help people the way she'd always wanted to, and she used that privilege to lift others up rather than put them down. As for Brittany and Todd, their picture-perfect marriage fell apart within a year. Turned out that a relationship built on appearances and status wasn't strong enough to survive real life. But Caroline rarely thought about them anymore. She was too busy being happy, too busy being loved, too busy being herself. Sometimes the people who deserve respect the most are the ones who demand it the least. Caroline didn't need her fiancé's money to have value. She already had it. Her family just couldn't see it. If this story gave you the justice you needed today, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me what you would have done in Caroline's position. Subscribe for more incredible stories of karma and comebacks. And remember, treat people with kindness. You never know who you're really talking to. See you in the next one.